Before we dive into the tutorial, I have some exciting news to share. YouTube now allows me to automatically translate my lessons into multiple major languages, making it much easier for you to follow along no matter where you are from. Here is a quick guide to change the audio language. First, open the video on YouTube. Second, click the gear icon in the bottom right corner to open settings. Third, select audio track. Fourth, choose the language that's most comfortable for you to listen in. That's it, now let's jump into the painting session. Hi, my name is Nick, and today we will be painting a rough meat texture. This video is part of a series of material tutorials that I have created especially for you. So subscribe to my YouTube channel so you don't miss any of my tutorials. Step 1. Base setup. To start, I prepared an isometric cube as the base shape. Using the lasso tool, I traced each visible plane and filled them with 3 different shades of red to establish the foundation of our meat texture. This variation will help guide the lighting, depth and realism of the final materials. I also go over our future meat chunk with a standard round brush, using darker shades of red, something like a mix between red and purple, which results in a more complex and rich red tone. Next, I created a new layer to begin adding white connective tissue veins across the red meat surface. I started sketching them in the corners using thin lines. The shape can be chaotic, but I highly recommend occasionally checking real-life references, because our imagination can sometimes lead us in the wrong direction. Without references, the veins might look unnatural in the final stage, so don't hesitate to use references. It's completely normal and very helpful. As you may have noticed, I made the veins on the top surface of the meat a lighter tone compared to those on the bottom. This is due to the way light hits the surface. In our case, the imaginary light source is positioned above, so the top plane of our meat cube will be the brightest area. The left side of the cube will have a mid-tone, while the right side will be the darkest, as it's farthest from the light. That's why the veins in the shadows should be rendered using cooler tones, a mix of white with subtle grayish-violet red hues, or something similar. I also added some thicker, more painterly strokes in a few areas to define the veins more clearly on top of the initial lines. This helped add a touch of believability and realism to our object. To make our meat cube appear more three-dimensional, I continue refining the details using colors and values. For example, in the shadowed area, I added subtle pinkish highlights on top of the cooler, grayish tones of the veins. This suggests some secondary side lighting, perhaps from a nearby object, and helps build depth. I also intensify the light tones in the upper lit part of the cube. Our main light source is coming from above. Finally, I added a few specular highlights, since raw meat tends to be moist and reflective under direct light. These small touches enhance the realism and texture of the surface. I also added brighter, more saturated red brush strokes toward the upper, well-lit area of the meat cube. Closer to the midtones and shadowed areas, I deepened the reds with darker shades, enhancing the overall lighting, contrast and volume. I paint the entire image using a standard hard round brush. I control the pressure sensitivity of the pen on the tablet to vary my strokes. In general, I'm not a big fan of textured brushes, as I've mentioned in my previous tutorial. I believe that textured brushes can break the form and make the object look flatter. It's much better to first learn how to build light, shadow and halftone properly. Once you understand the fundamentals, you can experiment with textured brushes or overlays. But that's just my personal experience. Everyone's brain is wired differently and interprets visuals in their own unique way. It felt a bit unrealistic to leave our meat cube with perfectly sharp edges. Those kind of surfaces are more typical of metal or other hard materials. That's why I decided to soften the edges directly on the main layer by erasing the corners slightly, making them look more rounded and organic. This gives the impression that the meat has been shaped into a cube, almost like raw steak molded into form, which feels much more believable. I continue refining the shape and contour of our meat cube. In the shadow area on the right side, I emphasize certain corners to strengthen the feeling of depth and form. This helps define the cube's shadowed plane more clearly. At the same time, I try to break up the perfectly straight lines of the cube's silhouette. This adds a more natural, organic feel, making it look less like a rigid geometric object and more like an actual chunk of meat. I also spend time detailing the internal muscle fibers and strands, gradually enhancing the texture to increase the realism and believability of the piece. Along the edges of the lid plane, I begin adding tiny white highlights using a small brush. These bright dots and strokes imitate the reflective fibers of raw meat under a direct light source. It's important to understand that you don't need to meticulously draw every fiber in microscopic detail. The illusion of texture can be achieved through well-placed highlights. Since the meat is raw, its moist surface catches the light, creating tiny reflections, especially where the form bends or curves. This is how light and form interact to create the illusion of volume and fine surface texture without overcomplicating the process. I felt it was important to refine the edges of our meat cube, so I used a thin, light brush to gently trace along the contours of the form. While doing this, I made sure to follow the natural direction of the surface, simulating the way light catches the indentations and subtle curves of the meat. In my opinion, this small step made a noticeable difference. The cube no longer looks like a dull block with straight edges. It now appears fibrous, organic, and more believable. It gives the impression of an actual piece of raw meat shaped into a cube, if you can imagine that. And that wraps up our raw meat cube painting. We've covered everything from blocking in the base colors, shaping light and shadow, to adding realistic fat streaks and surface details. As always, don't forget reference is your best friend, and building a strong understanding of form and lighting will take your work to the next level. If you found this tutorial helpful, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss upcoming lessons. Thanks for watching and keep practicing. See you in the next video.